My job used to be pretty straightforward. Night supervisor at a freight rail depot on the outskirts of Osaka. The kind of place that looks like it was built in the 70s and never bothered to modernize. I wasn't some high security guy or anything. Mostly I checked the incoming and outgoing manifests, made sure containers weren't leaking or broken, and reported to a regional logistics manager who rarely answered emails after 5 p.m. The depot had this weird kind of calm at night. No real sound apart from distant hums from industrial parks down the road and the occasional clang of metal from an old freight car settling. My shifts ran from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., and while there were usually 2 of us, I was alone that entire week because my coworker had taken sudden leave. HR didn't say why, and honestly, I didn't ask. I liked working alone. No one talked over the old radio. No one smoked near the cargo, and no one forgot to clock out. By the 3rd night, I had the rhythm down. Log the manifest, check the yard twice an hour, file the inventory. The warehouse lights flickered like they always did when I walked through the main corridor. It was routine, comfortable, until it wasn't. It started on a Tuesday. Around 1 a.m., I was checking a row of older freight containers that had been marked inactive for months. They just sat at the far edge of the yard, backed up against the perimeter fence near the woods. As I walked past them, I saw someone standing between 2 containers. Just standing. Still. Like they were waiting for something. They weren't wearing a uniform, and I couldn't see their face, just the silhouette of someone tall, maybe over 6 feet, stocky build, dark jacket. I froze for a second, then stepped forward and called out, "Hey, you're not supposed to be back here." No response. They didn't move, didn't flinch. I was maybe 30 feet away, and I couldn't tell if they were facing me or the container. I reached for the flashlight clipped to my belt, shined it toward the figure, and just like that they were gone. No sound, no movement. Just gone. I walked over, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. There was nothing between the containers. I even checked around the backs of them, still nothing. It wasn't exactly the kind of place you could disappear from easily. The whole yard was gravel, and it would have been impossible to run without making noise. I chalked it up to exhaustion. Maybe a shadow, maybe my mind playing tricks. I didn't report it. I went back to the office, made tea, and tried not to think about it. 2 nights later, it happened again. Same time, roughly 1 a.m. I was finishing a walkthrough when I heard the metallic bang of something being dropped. I followed the sound toward one of the maintenance sheds. Inside, the lights were off, but the door was ajar. I hadn't opened it that night. I stepped in slowly. The inside smelled of rust and old oil. There were tools, crates, and a long workbench along the left side. Nothing looked out of place, except for a single crowbar lying in the center of the floor. That hadn't been there earlier. I remembered clearly. It would have been a tripping hazard. Then I noticed something worse. The lock on the side hatch of one of the inactive containers had been cut. Not just loosened, sliced clean, like it had been hit with a heavy-duty tool. That lock had been intact for years. I reported it to management. They told me it was probably due to rust and instructed me to document it and replace the lock. But I couldn't shake it. Something was off. That night, I stayed near the office, watching the monitors closely. The cameras weren't exactly high-end, cheap, static-filled feeds with blind spots everywhere, but it was better than nothing. At 3:12 a.m., I saw movement near the far end of the yard. 2 figures this time, one crouching near the same container with the broken lock, the other standing watch. They weren't employees. No reflective vests, no flashlights, just moving slowly, deliberately, like they'd done this before. I grabbed the bat we kept under the desk, not regulation but better than nothing, and headed out. I didn't bother with the flashlight this time. I knew the yard well enough to navigate in the dark, but by the time I reached the container, they were gone again. Except, they hadn't left. The door to the container was open. Just slightly. Should have called the police right then. I should have backed off and waited. But curiosity or something deeper, something I can't name, pushed me forward. Inside the container was nothing but shadows. I leaned in, trying to listen. Then something brushed against my leg. I jumped back instinctively, hitting the gravel hard, and from inside, I heard a voice. Not speaking, whispering, not words, just breath rhythm like someone trying to keep quiet. I didn't wait around to find out more. I ran straight back to the office, locked the door, and waited for the sun. I filed a full incident report the next morning. Included screenshots from the video. Wrote down everything I could remember. That afternoon, management sent 2 guys from headquarters to inspect the yard. They reviewed the tapes. Then, without saying a word to me, they wiped the last 48 hours of footage and removed the camera pointed at the far end of the yard. They replaced it with a motion sensor floodlight. When I asked what they'd found, one of the guys smiled just slightly and said, "Nothing actionable." I never worked another night shift after that. They moved me to day logistics the next week. No explanation, no warning. Just a new badge, a new schedule, and a quiet note from HR saying they'd restructured operations. But here's what keeps me up. I still dream about that voice. Not the whisper. The breathing. It wasn't hiding. It was waiting. I've never liked working the overnight shift, but jobs are hard to come by in a place like ours. The tram station in District 8 only really comes alive when the sun's gone down. Late travelers, warehouse crews, drifters. I run the small ticket booth tucked at the back near the vending machines. People rarely talk to me, which is usually a good thing. But that night I really wished someone had been around. It was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your breathing. I was sketching in my notebook between ticket sales halfway through a doodle of some old train I saw once in a magazine, when Halim, the janitor, gave me a wave and headed toward the back lot for his dinner break. That left me alone. No passengers, no cleaners, just the hum of the soda machine and the flickering overhead light that never got fixed. Only a few minutes passed before a man walked in through the southern gate. He moved with this odd stiffness, like every joint was fighting him. Hoodie zipped up to his chin, gray pants, and a slouch that said he hadn't slept properly in days. I expected him to head toward the platforms, but instead, he made a slow, deliberate path to my booth. "I'm trying to find Farzana," he said, voice low and dry. "She told me to meet her here." I glanced down at my roster and recent logs. No Farzana was scheduled for any train tonight. I told him that. He just stared, like I was lying. I repeated myself, no Farzana, no one even remotely close to the manifest. He didn't argue, just nodded once, almost like he was confirming something in his head. Then he turned and left without another word. I watched him walk out through the gate and vanish around the corner of the maintenance depot. Something about him stuck with me. The way he looked at the walls instead of me, how his shoes didn't match. I shook it off. Creeps come and go, especially at night. Halim came back, complaining about the vending machine stealing his credits again. We traded a few jokes and settled into the long haul of the shift. At 4 a.m., I shut down the terminal, grabbed my bag, and walked toward the back gate where I'd chained up my bike. It was an old electric hybrid, clunky but dependable. The route home was an empty stretch of warehouse alleys and silent roads. No lamps, just the bluish glow from the occasional ad board flickering above. The feeling crept in about 10 minutes into the ride, that crawling itch between my shoulder blades. I glanced over my shoulder a few times. No headlights, no footsteps, no reason to be nervous. But I still was. I reached my building, a converted textile warehouse that now housed 20 cramped units stacked on top of each other. I rolled my bike into the courtyard, locked it, and climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. My key clicked in the door, and as always, I turned the lock behind me the second I stepped in. I hadn't even dropped my bag when I heard someone sprinting up the stairs outside. The sound was urgent. Too fast, too close. Then came the rattle of my doorknob, fierce and wild like someone was trying to tear it off. I froze. My apartment isn't big. 2 steps forward and I was already by the door, silently looking through the peephole. It was him. The man from the station. He pressed his face close to the door, eyes too wide like he was trying to see through it. "Please," he said. "I need to come in. Just for a minute, I need help." His voice wasn't desperate, it was rehearsed. I didn't move, didn't respond. My hand found my comm tab on the kitchen counter and I called the local patrol unit. The moment I gave my address, the man bolted. I saw him sprint down the stairwell and into the darkness of the alley, just as 2 patrol bikes turned the corner at the far end. The officers swept the area. One came up to my door, calm but tense, and asked me a strange question. "Is that your bike locked out back?" I said it was. "You left the rear cargo flap open." I hadn't. Not a chance. I always double-check it before I ride, especially in this part of the city. They checked the footage from nearby cams, and later that week they told me what I already feared. The man had been in the cargo hold of my bike the entire ride home, curled up beneath a tarp and toolkit. That's how he got to my door so quickly. He never had to follow me. He was already there. They caught him 3 days later, in another part of the district, loitering near a school's maintenance entry. He didn't resist, didn't explain anything, just kept repeating my name when they questioned him. He wasn't anyone I knew. Not a neighbor, not a passenger, not even a face from one of the local shelters. But somehow, he'd been watching me. For weeks, they said. Knew my schedule, knew my route. Waiting for a night I left something unlocked, even just once. I haven't seen him since. But now I check everything. Locks, cameras, the underside of my bike. I even stopped listening to music when I rode home. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I had parked inside the courtyard garage instead of outside that night. If I'd rolled right into my unit like I usually do, but I didn't. And that one small decision might have kept me alive. Back when I worked overnights at a small vending depot on the edge of the industrial zone, I used to think of the job as temporary, the kind of job you take while figuring life out. I'd sit behind a metal desk in the corner of a converted shipping container, checking restock orders and playing bootleg anime through the company's busted Wi-Fi. The floor smelled like old rubber tires and soy sauce. Don't ask me why, but it was quiet, and that meant I could finish my online coursework while getting paid. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Most of the vendors only picked up supplies during the day, so my job was mostly keeping things logged, unlocking the gate if a late delivery came in, and making sure the building didn't burn down. It was just me, a microwave and a flickering halogen light that made a soft buzz like a fly trapped in a jar. One night, around 2 a.m., I was halfway through a statistics lecture when the gate buzzer chirped. Surprised me, honestly. We didn't get many drop-ins at that hour. I pulled up the camera feed. It was a man in a yellow windbreaker standing perfectly still outside the gate. No delivery van, no truck, just him. I pressed the intercom. "Can I help you?" He didn't answer. Just pointed to the ID scanner like he was supposed to be there. The rules said to deny access without verification, but something about his face made me hesitate. He didn't look threatening, just out of place. Tired eyes, stubbly jaw. Like he hadn't slept in days. Against my better judgment, I buzzed him in. I figured maybe he was a tech or late-night cleaner. He stepped inside, nodded once, then walked straight past the desk without a word. "Hey, do you need anything?" I asked. He raised a hand dismissively. "Just the restroom," he mumbled, and disappeared down the hallway. That was the first weird part. The restroom? People didn't usually sneak into secured depots just to pee. But I shrugged it off. Maybe he worked in the next unit over and had some kind of key card issue. Maybe he just didn't want to talk. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The hallway camera showed no movement. I stood up, stretched, and walked toward the back. The restroom was a converted janitor's closet, tucked between two inventory rooms. I knocked lightly on the door. No response. I knocked again, louder. Still, nothing. I don't know what made my stomach twist, but it did. I turned around and headed back to the desk, called the site supervisor. She didn't answer, so I left a message trying to sound calm. Then I called building security. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but didn't seem in a rush. It wasn't exactly a high-priority call. About 10 minutes later, a campus patrol truck rolled into the lot. A heavy-set guard named Raf got out, coffee in hand, and gave me a lazy nod. "What's going on?" he asked. "Guy came in, went to the restroom 25 minutes ago, hasn't come out." I didn't get his name or badge. Raf raised an eyebrow, walked over, and banged on the door with the side of his fist. "Security. Open up." Nothing. He turned to me. "You got the key?" I did, reluctantly. My hand was clammy as I passed it over. He unlocked the door, yanked it open, and froze. There was no one inside. I leaned over to see for myself. Empty. Lights on. Faucet dripping. No broken windows. No second exit. I swore under my breath. "He never came out," I said. "I've been watching the hallway cam. No movement at all." Raf looked up at the ceiling, then at the small access panel above the sink. "Storage ceiling?" he asked. I nodded. The depot's crawl space ran across the top of the building, just a hollow between the ceiling tiles and the roof, used for cables and old junk storage. Raf called for backup. Another patrol car arrived within 10 minutes. They brought a ladder, a flashlight, and a lot more attitude. While they were getting set up, I watched the hallway feed again, scrolling back. Sure enough, the man went into the restroom, and then nothing. No exit. No flicker of movement on any camera. It was like he vanished. One of the guards poked his head up into the crawl space. He didn't speak for a few seconds, then called down, "Found something." Turned out the guy had climbed onto the sink, pushed open the access panel, and crawled inside. He was curled up in the corner behind a broken exhaust vent, half covered, in fiberglass insulation. He wasn't hiding from me, he was hiding from someone else. Police were called. They arrived quickly, this time in full uniform, not private security. Apparently, the man had a warrant out across 2 provinces. Armed robbery, assault, possible connection to a missing persons case. He'd been on the run for weeks, sleeping in abandoned buildings and dodging cameras. Somehow he'd slipped through the net and wandered into our depot. They think he spotted the patrol lights on the highway and panicked, figuring the depot was a quiet place to disappear. When they pulled him out of the crawl space, he didn't resist, just blinked against the light and muttered something I couldn't hear. Later, one of the officers told me that if I hadn't buzzed him in, he might have broken in somewhere else, or worse. Another quiet building, another person alone. I still don't know whether I made the right call. For weeks after that, I'd glance at the camera feeds every few minutes, half expecting someone else to slip in and vanish. I stopped doing schoolwork on shift, just watched and waited. The vending depot didn't feel quiet anymore, it felt hollow, like someone could be watching from behind the ceiling tiles at any moment. Eventually, I quit the job and moved on, but I never forgot the man in the windbreaker. And I never leave restroom doors unchecked.